Az önce de söylediğim gibi bugünkü toplantımızdaki önemli bölümlerden bir tanesi de Greg Türkiye'deyken ondan dinleyeceğimiz sözler. Greg Clark davet ediyorum şimdi. Az önce de söylediğim gibi ULI Senior Fellow, CLL'in de önemli çalışmalarına katkı veriyor. Dün akşam CLL'in açıkladığı önemli bir rapor vardı. Dünya sahnesinde İstanbul, İstanbul benim diye. O raporun tanıtım toplantısında da çok keyifli bir konuşma yaptı. Eminim bugün de bize çok lezzetli şeyler söyleyecek. Greg, floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I need to begin by saying a special thank you to my friends and colleagues at JLL, Avi Alkash, Jeremy Kelly, Rosemary Feenan, thank you. My colleagues at the Urban Land Institute, Aisha, thank you. Lizette, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. And Ersan, thank you to PwC for inviting me to be with you here today. As you can see from the title of my slides, I'm going to be talking about Istanbul from the outside in, using global benchmark studies like the Emerging Trends, but not the same as the Emerging Trends report, to tell you something about a visitor's perspective on Istanbul. And I hope that this will be the perfect introduction to Lizette, who will then, of course, present the Emerging Trends report to you very shortly. And we look forward to hearing about that. Now, to make this speech, I'm going to focus upon 6 reports that have been published within the last year. These are 2 reports that the Urban Land Institute published during the last 6 months about urban density and how and why cities in Europe are promoting density, not because we like density of itself, but because density is a way of having a more productive economy, a more sustainable environment, a better mix socially. It's a way of providing value and capital to finance infrastructure. It's a way of accommodating the new mixture of uses promoted by the new technologies that Aisha was referring to a few minutes ago. And when we prepared these studies, we prepared a case study of Istanbul. And let me say immediately thank you to everyone from ULI Turkey who contributed to this case study. I'm going to try to introduce that for you. And at the same time, in the last 6 months, Jones Lang LaSalle has published 2 wonderful reports about the worlds of cities, the new world of cities and the changing dynamics of cities. And just yesterday evening, Jones Lang LaSalle published this new report on Turkey, looking at Istanbul on the world stage, where Istanbul's new cycle and new opportunities are going. So I'm using these 6 reports to try to say something to you that I hope will be of interest this morning. Now, many of you know that globalization and urbanization are in a certain sense synchronized. The process of cities growing and developing and becoming internationally prominent is synchronized with waves of trade development, geopolitical change, technological development, and Istanbul has managed to surf more than one of these waves. Istanbul is the only city that has been a global city in 3 great epochs of human civilization, as Byzantium, as Constantinople, now as Istanbul. And you can see in my slide that in the 1400s, Istanbul was entering the global system of trade through its role in the silk routes and the spice routes, its role as the great entrepot between Asia and Europe. And I believe that this should give you confidence that Istanbul has the DNA necessary to take advantage of global change and to be a prominent city, a junction box, an entrepot, a knowledge center for many years to come. Istanbul has the openness, it has the opportunity, and it also has the problem-solving DNA which is so needed. This is particularly important at the moment because the silk routes are coming back. The Chinese government, with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, is investing nearly $2 trillion over the next 30 years, building the new Silk routes, the new maritime ports, the new maritime ways, but also building the infrastructure, not just to connect China with the rest of the world again, but to create an environment in which China's own economy can balance with its growth to the West. So this provides Istanbul once again, as if history was repeating itself, with the opportunity to become again that great entrepot between Asia and Europe. And the effect of this kind of infrastructure is to enable cities in Asia to become more systematic, more specialized, more differentiated from one another. It enables them, as it were, to become new partners for Istanbul in a larger Eurasian system of cities that's going to be very important for the long term. Now, my friend's coming onto the stage. Is there a sound problem? Okay, good. So this reminds us, of course, of why cities grow. Successful cities grow. They attract population. And Istanbul has had a huge population growth over the last period of time. But that growth comes from the opportunity created by what we call agglomeration. As we put together people and businesses in the same place, the advantages that occur from sharing the same platforms of infrastructure, the same knowledge base, the same skills, the same logistics system, the same real estate system are so strong that cities create all of these opportunities. That's why people come to Istanbul. But we know also that the growth of cities creates externalities. We have congestion, we have pollution, inflation, we have opposition to the growth model, we have sprawl, we have increasing costs. And these are the indicators of a successful city that needs to then adopt a medicine in order to heal. In other words, inflation, congestion, sprawl, these are not indicators of failure. These are generally indicators of success in cities, but they require interventions in order for them to be remedied, in order for growth to continue through several cycles. Now, we can observe all of this when we start to look at the global indexes of cities, like the Emerging Trends report that you'll have introduced to you shortly. And when we look at how cities are ranked and benchmarked and compared, we see two things. We see, firstly, the things that make cities successful in the first place, the attractiveness, the skills, the visitability, the iconic architecture, the clusters of businesses. But we also observe the ability of cities to solve problems, the ability of cities to manage growth, the ability of cities to work through cycles of success, to sustain success. And I think this is very important in helping us to see what is needed for any city at a period in its own development. Now, in the Jones-Lang-LaSalle reports that I referred to earlier, we began to identify some types of cities. If you like, the big change here is that the old hierarchies are fading. It's not the case that all cities compete with all other cities. Cities can be seen in clusters and groupings. They can be seen as benchmarking clubs. They can be seen in leagues. And in particular, we want to place attention today on the group we call the emerging world cities. The Shanghais, the Seouls, the Sao Paulos, the Istanbuls, the great cities of the world, the big mega cities that connect the most rapidly growing marketplace into the global economy as a means to help develop not just their city, but also their nation. So you can't read this slide, don't worry about that. The second grouping here, the emerging world cities, where we have Istanbul, Seoul, Sao Paulo, Shanghai, Mexico City, you can see for all of these cities, the issues are the same. Metropolitan infrastructure, urban restructuring to rationalize land use, quality-oriented growth, strategic coordination of different things, putting together infrastructure with land use, with education, with healthcare, with resilience. These are the issues not just for Istanbul, but for Seoul, for Sao Paulo, for Shanghai, for Mexico City as well. So Istanbul is not alone. When we look at these emerging world cities, we see they're rapidly becoming the new economic geography. They're integrating global functions, they're great centers of demand and supply, new headquarters locations, they're new knowledge centers through their universities, and some of them are also becoming very successful financial centers. So you can see here the growth of these cities as financial centers is a phenomenal process of change, as these cities are adding international financial districts, they're adding the business climate for financial services to grow, they are becoming very important centers in their own right, and as you can see, Tokyo and Paris have been overtaken by Shanghai, Singapore, and Taipei. When we look at these emerging world cities, we see that Shanghai and Beijing and Dubai are nearly emerged. They've become stable, established cities where the challenges of population growth have largely been overcome through urban planning, infrastructure, and urban management. We then see a second group of what we would call competitive megacities, where Istanbul is the leader. Istanbul is the leading city in this group, pushing to become one of the very top cities in this system, along with Shanghai and Beijing, the most emerged of the emerging world cities. And when we look in more detail at the needs of these cities, we can identify what they need to do in housing, in land use, in talent, in infrastructure, in sector development, in brand and identity. It's very clear that these cities have to combine scale with quality. They have to combine initiative with coordination. They have to take multi-cycle approaches to land use and to transportation. Essentially, they need strategic planning in order to really make the most of the opportunities they have. So using these studies, we can also look individually at Istanbul and begin to say, what is Istanbul doing that is so important? Now, from the outside in, Istanbul is the 23rd most visible city in the world. What do I mean? I mean that in the 200 benchmarking reports that Jones Lang LaSalle have reviewed, Istanbul is the 23rd most recognized city. That's very important because Istanbul's visibility is growing. So you expect to see London and Paris and New York at the top of this list, and Mumbai and Milan. But Istanbul is there, becoming more recognized, becoming the focus of many more international studies as the world begins to take Istanbul increasingly more seriously. Istanbul is a rising star in business, investment, and talent attraction. It's also a city that is becoming a knowledge hub. Its universities are being recognized, its research centers being acknowledged, and its ability with technology and innovation is seen as one of its emerging strengths. And although there is a high expectation now of Istanbul's ultimate success, there are still some concerns about quality of life, security, sustainability. These things need attention. Let me put it another way. The world loves Istanbul, but it doesn't yet completely trust Istanbul in a certain way. In order to trust Istanbul, as well as to love Istanbul, it needs to be reassured on quality and on transparency. Those are the things where the world has some doubts. This new study from the Global Cities Power Index undertaken at Tokyo University is very interesting. It shows you that visitors love Istanbul. This is a city that everybody wants to visit before they die. But it also shows you that residents have an experience of living in Istanbul which is not of the highest quality of life, and therefore this gap between the visitor experience and the resident experience is a very important challenge for Istanbul to address. Now, you know, because you live it every day, that these growth management challenges are very visible. Chronic transport congestion, some of the weaknesses in the system quality, the environmental health, the social development. But the great news, as you know, is that Istanbul's infrastructure investment program is huge, and we'll go through that shortly. And the world is coming to recognize that infrastructure investment is the right thing for Istanbul. The question is how to translate infrastructure investment into urban quality, how to translate it into a polycentric, well-organized and coordinated city, how to translate infrastructure investment into the reallocation and the rational use of land in order to create a city which is more coherent at the same time as retaining its dynamic and magical structure. So I tried to compare Istanbul, along with my friends and colleagues at JLL, on all of the 200 indexes. And it's very clear that what you see is very obvious. Visitor, culture, the investment attractiveness, the costs, the wages, the talent, all score very highly. The problems here are sustainability, the completion of the infrastructure program, and the business climate. It's very obvious in 200 studies, these are the issues that emerge. And we can summarize them very simply. It's a leading city amongst these emerging world cities. It's recognized as a city of culture, diversity, opportunity, trade, history. Its external transport investment is now being recognized and reflected. It has an improved talent pool and a great R&D platform with universities, a massive infrastructure investment program. But the visitor experience is better than the resident experience. The business brand is improving, but there's concerns about whether the city is organized for success. Governance and business risk issues are to the fore, and the platform for sustained long-term multi-cycle investment is not yet there. This is what the outside-in perspective on Istanbul tells you. You don't have to visit Istanbul, you just read all the studies. It tells you this. I'm not reporting what I think, I'm telling you what 200 studies tell us about Istanbul. Now, when we look at the question of density, it's a very interesting lens to take on any city. And ULI, in its work on density, tried to use this as a way to understand the dynamics of what's happening in each city. The first point I want to make is that ULI very clearly decided that this study is not about promoting any kind of density. The fundamental observation in the ULI work on density is that we know the difference now between good density and bad density. In other words, good density is often mixed use, it's well connected, it's planned and systematic, it's spacious, it focuses on livability, it's incremental and gradual, it's well designed, it's green, it's appropriate, it's cohesive, it brings places together. We know the elements of good density very, very well. We also know, because we learned from past experience, what are the elements of bad density. It's monotonous, boring, it's isolated, it's unmanaged, unlivable, conspicuous, it looks wrong, it's polluting, it's ugly, it's crowded, segregated, inflexible. So we know from historical experience all over the world what is good density and what is bad density now. And what ULI wishes to do is to lead a public education program to understand what's good density so that people can opt for good density all of the time. And this means that we no longer want to see isolated developments which are disconnected from one another. We don't want to see what we had with the public housing projects or with the isolated shopping malls or the new financial districts that are completely separate from every other part of the city. Now, we learned from our studies that density plays different roles in different kinds of cities. For the fast-growing cities like London and Stockholm and Istanbul, it's about adding capacity, it's about creating polycentricity, it's about creating a new way of using land so that land is used in an optimal way. That's very different from how density is used in Dresden or in Birmingham or in Warsaw. We also learned that a positive psychology of density is very important to communicate the advantages of density, to create a sense of belonging, to have people participate in the process of building denser cities. And we ended up with a new equation on density, 9 elements that we think are essential for a city to make real progress. So we have to have the fundamentals right. Leadership, vision, planning, branding. We have to execute effectively with tactics, scale, with financial, legal, and land use tools. And we need to build momentum, multi-cycle approaches, stimulating demand, and that positive psychology. And we can begin to benchmark cities on how they're performing in this new density equation. And later I'll show you the Istanbul equation as I think it is. Istanbul, as you know, is an incredibly fast-growing city. 59% additional population since 2000, new big sectors, health, education, professional services, ICT. These are great sectors to be specialized in. And you know that Istanbul has an amazing legacy and DNA, a great city, but overwhelmed by the pace and the scale of population growth from 1980 all the way through to today. In other words, no city could have developed in a coherent way with this kind of population growth. But in this cycle, maybe it has the opportunity to do that. It has surged since 1990. The population growth in Istanbul has been phenomenal by all global standards, and the Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality has done many good things to help Istanbul cope with this growth. It's made important improvements, but the pace of growth has been too fast even for the improvements that have been made. We know from our experience in Hong Kong and Seoul and Tokyo that a spatial development plan is very important. It's a spatial plan that enables us to use infrastructure to build quality, to create a city where land is more correctly used, where real estate can add real value, where resilience and a logical proposition about housing and other kinds of social infrastructure can be put together. And our observation was that the Istanbul Master Plan of 2007 was a good plan, but perhaps not pursued for long enough to really make it work. And when you look at the huge range of economic and policy initiatives that have been taken for Istanbul, it's very clear that what's needed in this city is for these things to come together in a sustained program of organized intervention to really build the city. So we tried to summarize all of that in drivers, enablers, and barriers for Istanbul's development. So when we think about what is missing later in the conversation, we can see that there has been, the lack of a consistent city development plan. There has been some challenges in terms of, overseeing land uses and making them work. There has been not the right sequencing of infrastructure with growth. And there has been difficulty, making some of the key projects absolutely bankable. However, for many, many reasons, I'm very optimistic about the next cycle of Istanbul's growth and development. As you know, the infrastructure investment program in Istanbul at the moment makes it a kind of world champion of infrastructure. If you look at the airport, the bridge, the tunnel, the second bridge, the canal, the metro and the tram extensions, all of these things create the opportunity to build a new Istanbul. This is the platform for changing the spatial character of Istanbul and making the growth that has happened manageable. That will require, of course, a strong regional dimension. Istanbul will become a regional city, not just a metropolitan city. And that regional scale is key. We've seen that in the Pearl River Delta with Hong Kong, in South Korea with Seoul, building that regional program using this amazing program of infrastructure is key for the next stage. Now, I promised to show you what I think is the equation for density and urban development in Istanbul. We saw, looking at the fundamentals, there clearly is leadership and vision. There clearly is a very strong brand, but we didn't see a consistent plan in the future of Istanbul. When we looked at execution, we saw scale, we saw the financing, legal and land use tools are there, but we didn't necessarily see the tactics of sequencing projects in the right way, or of building at scale the new polycentric centers. And when we looked at momentum, we see amazing demand for Istanbul, but we didn't yet see the multi-cycle approaches and the positive psychology. So this is a draft. I know it's not perfect, but if you want to know what is missing in Istanbul, maybe some of these things point you in that direction. This is comparing Istanbul to the other cities in our study. So, lots of reasons to be optimistic about Istanbul, and very clear, I think, that it's obvious to everyone what is needed now. I think it's possible for Istanbul to avoid the decline that would come with the journey from good-ish density to not so good density, and for Istanbul to turn the corner and go back towards being a good higher density city with a polycentric structure supported by this amazing infrastructure platform, and to make that shift, as it were, from the risk of bad density to the promise of good density. Now, as I said before, Istanbul is not alone. It's been a leading city in these three great epochs of civilization, and it means that Istanbul does have the DNA needed to solve problems and succeed. But maybe that DNA needs to present itself in a new way. Being a leading city, as I said before, means celebrating and promoting success and assets and opportunities, but it also means solving problems for the long term so that the city can learn how to build and manage great cities. And that would be good not just for Istanbul, but also for the world. So the world needs Istanbul to learn how to solve these growth challenges in order to succeed. So I encourage you, if I may, to read the JLL report and to read the ULI case study on Istanbul, and of course to read the PricewaterhouseCoopers ULI Emerging Trends report, which will put Istanbul's current opportunities in a broader context, and I know that's what you're going to hear next. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Greg. Thank you. Çok teşekkür ediyoruz Greg'e. İstanbul yalnız değil derken biraz da dün akşam yaptığı prezentasyondan esinlenerek şunu söylüyorum. Yalnız değil derken İstanbul'un karşısındaki problemleri yaşamış bir yığın ülkenin, bir yığın şehrin olduğunu ve oralardaki örneklerle mutlaka bir çözüme ulaştırılabileceğine inanıyor. Ama iyi bir density için, iyi bir yoğunluk için fundamentallerden eksik olan ne diye baktığımızda da plan görüyoruz. Çok önemli bir husus. Plan olmazsa devamı da gelmiyor demek ki. Çok teşekkürler gene güzel sunumu için.